I'm Randal Weidenaar, and I'm here with Justin Fike. Justin, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Justin Fike. I'm an author, a life coach. The thing I'm really passionate about, if you really boil it down, is working with people to help them be fully freed up and unleashed in discovering their potential and actually stewarding their design and identity in a more intentional and effective way. So I work with an organization called Growth Dynamics International, which is an apostolic resourcing network that provides relational support and perspective and coaching to the point leaders of other networks, the people that ironically don't always get as much attention and input and oversight because they're the ones who are kind of leading the network that they're a part of.
So you're working with the leaders at this point in time, and also with the staff in general, the whole organization out there, right?
Yeah, so I'm here in Thailand with one of the networks that are a part of GDI. They're doing their annual intake training process where the members that come in to join every year, they come through a 7-week training process, live together and go through learning about the values of the network and being kind of taught and trained and work a lot of resources and perspective and such. So they asked us to come out here to be part of that, to be working with the staff who are doing that, resourcing them, and also to run the Destiny Discovery Quest process here, which is kind of their capstone process that helps the individual students. It's a course process that's been designed to help people really dig into learning more about their design and kind of their purpose from that perspective.
This is kind of the angle that I think we're going to talk about. And like here at Curation, we often talk about identity in terms of 4 different sort of quadrants or looks at it. One being sort of the relational to God, like who am I deep down spiritually? Am I a loved individual? That's sort of a relational identity. And then we also look at it from sort of a presentness, like how am I feeling presently? Being in touch with that presently. And then another quadrant is memories. What is my story? Because really, if you were to take our memories away, we wouldn't be anything other than, just a person. It's our memories that really make up a huge part of who we are. But, you've been working with this 4th quadrant, what we call traits, or I don't know how you would describe it, but it helps people discover a lot about who they are, maybe occupationally. Speak a little bit more about that and how they relate to a group as a whole.
Well, the word that we use a lot of times to describe it, we talk about wiring, in that sense of like, if you take a machine or something, or a computer even, and you pull it apart, what's on the inside, a lot of it's been sort of purposefully created to achieve an outcome, right? It's the wires and lighting that get the energy from one point to another point. The more you start to discover sort of the pathways and the natural responses and the skills and talents and perspectives and values and all those different pieces that because we're actually incredibly complex and multifaceted creations. So that's a large picture. But the more you start to discover individual pieces of that, the paradigm that we work from is a concept that we call discerning your purpose through your design.
Okay.
The metaphor that we often use is like if you go out to a parking lot in front of a store, you could walk down the row and look at a whole bunch of cars that are all parked there, and you may not have actually, you probably weren't in the design meeting where that car was thought up, and the engineers who were working on it were like, what are we going to create here? But just by looking at the end result, you could infer a lot of things about the purpose that they had in mind for that car. And purpose doesn't mean one specific task. Purpose is a pretty broad term in some ways but you could look at a vehicle and say, well, it's about big. It has sliding doors and a lot of seat room.
Uh-huh.
That probably is intended to carry people around. That one over there has an open back that you could load stuff into really easily. That one has no room for any luggage whatsoever, but man, it looks really nice. I bet it goes really fast. And so even though you may not actually know anything officially about what the designer of that car intended, just by looking at its design, you could start to make some assumptions about ways that it could be used well and ways that you could probably try to make it work, but it might not actually be the most effective thing. It might even cause damage to the car if you try to force it to do something that it really wasn't designed to do well. So kind of working with that idea, as we start to, if we are working from the assumption that we were each intentionally created by a God who knew us intimately before we were formed in our mother's womb, which is what Psalms 139 says, and that he had some things in mind when he did that, then if we start looking into that design, we could, and we get some clarity about what those pieces are and how he put us together, from that we can then start actually confidently making some conclusions about things that we will be fit for, and like what kinds of effective things we could be going and living out of in our life.
I assume that you probably see, like, if people come to this and, you know, to continue with your metaphor, and they find that they're a compact car that only likes 2 people, and they see a bus pull up next that can haul, you know, and they might feel, you know, inadequacies or shame about who they are, thinking like, gosh, I wasn't created to be a bus. They throw themselves under the bus, so to speak. You know? Are there other traits that you've seen that fit into that kind of mold? If people don't see themselves in the proper way, that it causes dysfunctional, both personally and, you know, in life in general?
One of the big ones, it has to do with how people make decisions. You have certain types of people tend to process through decisions in a more sort of logical, in the sense that, you know, I'm going to move through the data and the facts, compare them all together, and come to a conclusion. Some people tend to be a bit more intuitive with their decision-making process and include other factors or heavily weight certain things, and so that's really easy to kind of look at each other at cross purposes. And for 2 people who have those different tendencies in decision-making, all of a sudden when they're trying to make decisions together, one of the things that this is what we tend to really work at the organizational cultural development level, is it's one thing to start to learn more about your design and live out of that, which is great. But actually, the reason that it's ultimately really valuable is that it enables us to start recognizing and celebrating and valuing other people's design. So on the one hand, it's an awareness that, like, wow, the way that I've been created is awesome and wonderful, and I'm actually going to be able to live more confidently out of that and stop laboring under this load of pressure and expectation where I'm constantly looking around at all the things that I'm not, as though that's what my life should be about. But on the other hand, then you actually get to recognize, hey, God didn't make me with every human trait that's good. You know, I have some and not others. I need these other people in my life in order for things to work out well and to flourish and grow. And so as...
It must
Go ahead.
come out in like marriages as well. I mean, I gave an example. I don't know if you have any insight into like relationships that you've seen, or, you know, personal things, if you want to go there too.
Yep.
As to how
it definitely
works out.
Yeah, it plays out in parenting relationships a lot.
Yeah, that's true too.
Because it's those things that, as a parent, you know, you see your child through all these different stages of life, and when they hit that sort of early adolescence stage and they really begin to come into the fullness of who they actually are as an individual and increasingly as an adult, and those things begin to be formed, sometimes it's easy to not realize how much you're not tracking what that actually means.
We want them to be like us.
Right, or you're
or the
relating
best
to them.
us that we never really achieved.
Yeah, and usually the way that it tends to play out is, in the best case scenario, it's often coming from a place of good motive. Like, we want the best for somebody else, and because we live in our own skin, and we're so familiar, like, we think the way we think, and the things that are important to us just make sense. So whether it may not even be trying to impose, like consciously trying to impose something on them, but when you genuinely want the best for someone, it's a very short step for you to then think, oh, and obviously the best for you would be this, because that's what's important to me, and I get why that's a big deal. Rather than, I want the best for you, what does the best for you actually look like?
And I found in my life that it's a slippery slope. It's an easy step from going to, they're not seeing the things the way I see them, and then to attribute to a character flaw in the other person.
Exactly.
And then it becomes, you know, it spirals into feelings of you know, hate, anger, frustration, you know, and all sorts of dissidence in relationships because we see it as a character flaw rather than a virtue, that they have
Right.
something different than me, you know,
Yeah.
or they have a different
Yeah.
perspective,
Absolutely.
or that they're
One of
somehow
one of
deficient
my
in one area that I'm strong in.
Right. Rather than looking at it as I have something to offer them, and by extension, they have a lot to offer me, because the very things that I don't understand and don't come naturally to me are the things that they carry with them. One of my favorite sections of scriptures where Paul talks about what the kingdom should look like as a body. And we kind of gloss over that area where we read it and we're like, oh yeah, that's nice, so that the hands and the feet and all that stuff. But actually, if you stop and think about what a body really is, it's one of the most complex organisms, one of the most complex machines on the planet. And the only way that a body works healthily is if lots of really, really different parts that do really, really different things are all connected together to make one thing, and they're not fighting each other. And if you think about it like in terms of medical science, our word for when a body starts to fight itself is like really awful diseases that kill you.
Yeah.
You know, when your body starts trying to reject a part of itself because it doesn't recognize it, or one part of the body starts to try and override the other, or kind of tries to impose its own, like that, as soon as that starts to happen, you have real problems. So I think it was a brilliant metaphor for him to use for the way that the kingdom and the family of God is supposed to function, because it requires each one of us to fully understand and embrace, where do I fit into this picture? What is my function? And if I'm abdicating that and living in a kind of a lazy mode, or I'm not fully stewarding what that means, then something is missing, and that's really bad, right? You have organ failure, or,
Yeah.
or like limbs missing, like things
So
start to fail.
Let's get a little bit more specific here. What are we talking about? What are people needing to discover? I mean, because I think a lot of times in my mind, I read through that. Oh, that's nice. We're an arm, but I thought he's an accountant. I'm an Indian
Right.
chief. He's the butcher. I'm the baker. But we're actually talking about something deeper than that. Obviously, we're talking about different kinds of traits. Let's get into details. What are some things that you help people discover who they are? You talked about how people process making decisions. Are there some others that you could just sort of bring into our attention here?
Concretely? Yeah. Well, so there's a whole area that we tend to look at which has to do with personality type discovery, which it tends to be the area that if people do start to look at this, they get there first, because there are systems that have already been created for that. So things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, that's
Okay.
a personality system. The Strength Finders assessment,
Okay.
the Saboteurs system. There's I could run through a couple of others as well. There's kind of a lot of them because, as I said, human beings are really complex and interesting and hard to nail down and figure out.
Yeah.
But so usually, when I've done sort of more extensive design coaching with someone, I will always start by having them run through about 4 of those, because those give a really good baseline for beginning to understand who am I and how do I function? Like, what are my natural tendencies when it comes to, like as we said, how I make decisions, how I relate to other people, how I process things emotionally and mentally, like process the things that are happening to me. There's something called the core needs quadrant,
Okay.
which is a really helpful way of thinking about what are the things that are primarily motivating to me.
Okay. Is that core needs? We've talked about that a little bit in some of our coaching sessions. Like, I call them destiny values. Is that kind of the same thing? Like, give some examples of core. Like, one of the things that I discovered is I value learning and creativity, and those are kind of 2 of my high end relationships. So it's like I like to do creativity in relationship, and I have to process my creativity, and if I don't, it doesn't flourish as well. And so, are there other traits like that you guys uncover? I mean, other values, that we're discussing that are important? Mm-hmm. Give some, like, what are your primary values that you've found to be sort of motivationally for you spiritually?
Yeah, one of the main sections in the Destiny Discovery Quest process that we just wrapped up today, actually, the last day of this week, is a whole section where we look at values, and the sort of the paradigm that we operate out of there is that this concept of core personal values.
Okay.
When we do talk about values, we tend to talk about values as sort of like a kitchen soup,
Or
where there's
universal
sort of
values
all
like patience,
universal,
altruism,
out there.
goodness, kindness.
And we all, yeah, and it's sort of this idea that like we should all be valuing all of these things equally all the time.
Yeah, sure.
Like that we should all aspire to them. But actually what we look at is that this idea of core personal values, which is that God himself, when he creates every person, takes some of the aspects of his own nature and character that he really values and appreciates about himself, and he intentionally kind of sews those into almost like the DNA of the person that he's creating.
Yeah.
And they carry like a small subset of those things that are just so hard coded the way that they think and live that they live out of them, and they actually then, in the ideal way, they incarnate what that really looks like lived out in practice. So you actually already named creativity and learning. Those are parts of who God is that he really, really values about himself, and he's invested those in you. But things like compassion or justice, or, I mean, you could go on and give those other lists.
And it's interesting. We were talking like my creativity sometimes makes me, the flip side of that is not being so generous, because a creative person likes resources.
Right.
A learning person.
It's always a shadow side.
My learning is great in that I learn and investigate new things, but I sometimes never camp out and actually develop the camp because, oh, look over there, there's something else to learn. So I'm always traveling on to the next new interesting novelty to learn about it. But I miss out on the here and now sometimes. So a lot of these values have flip sides to them that can be a weakness.
Yes, essentially every value taken to its sort of most fallen extreme actually becomes the opposite of what it is. And that is just true across the board. One of the things that we end up working on once someone has gotten to the point where they're beginning to see and are able to name those aspects of their design is this idea that a big part of what God works with us throughout the whole course of our life is a process of maturation and discipline over time in precisely the areas of our own wiring to help us become not what we call gifts driven, where I have all these things, like we're made these ways, but it's entirely possible to spend a large portion of your life unable to do anything else. Like you're gifts driven. It's almost like you're controlled by your wiring rather than the other way around. So even in situations where it's actually maybe hurtful to you or less effective or hurtful to other people, you're so unaware of your own wiring that you're not able to do anything about it. You're not able to be gifts disciplined, which is so moving from that process of being gifts driven to becoming gifts disciplined, which is precisely what Jesus modeled. Is he actually became fully disciplined in the fullness of who he was as a person, and that was what actually enabled him to live out his purpose and his call so effectively.
Yeah, so that's a really unique concept, because like in a lot of times I see a lot of coaches and things like that just really impressing on people. Find out who you are and just live out of that, and that's a lot of pressure. It's like, oh gosh, what if I'm not fully realizing my full self by doing accounting in my business instead of just being creative? Or my children are so distracting from my creative and learning pursuits. It's like, what do you do with like a 1-year-old who's like drooling and playing with blocks, and you're like, oh, but I have to have this great, you really do have to like sacrifice to pay attention to someone and to attune to something for a period of time. And, we are called to both live out of that and then being able to hold that dynamic attention of like, ooh, this one kind of grates on me, but I still have to hold it in tension for a while here. So it's like, learning that balance of going like, because there have been jobs that I've taken that I realized, really, there were places where I was in my life where my creativity was so squelched that it was kind of death to me,
Right.
And so it was important for me to move on from those places and to find places that I can really be more in tune with who I am and who God made me to be, rather than just to be, grinding away at something I thought was pretty noble even.
Yeah. Yep. But once it's not until you become intentionally aware of what those things are that you are able to become more healthy in them, because otherwise you tend to swing wildly from laboring under the pressure or the assumption that you're probably missing something and you ought to be doing it this way because surely you couldn't just, like, that's just me, that's just how I like to do things, right? I don't get that. What I really ought to be doing is probably this more responsible thing over here or whatever. And then the next day we'll swing wildly to the other side of the spectrum, which is, why don't these people get it? Like this, why is everyone this way? And why can't they just see that this is a better way to do things?
Yeah.
But becoming aware of what those things are actually allows us to get a lot more centered. And on the one hand, to fully embrace and say, these are the things that God gave me. I have to steward them and live out of this. And so, this decision or this environment or maybe even this relationship is not really the best way for me to do that. But then on the other side to say, and now that I see that, I get to participate in the incredible privilege of living sacrificially towards other people and choosing not to insist on, well, it has to be my way all the time in every moment of my life, because I'm aware of those things, so I can choose to lay them down in a moment where that's what God's indicating is the right thing to do, or you're clear that that's what's needed for the situation or for that other person.
And this is the great dynamic, the flow of life, where, the great irony is, I'm this, if you took all these personality tests, my wife and I, we score polar opposite on every single test, and God puts me together with this amazing woman who, is so different from me, but challenges me to, in that difference, she challenges me to live more honestly and true to who I am,
Right.
And I've always been dragging her away from who she really is until more recently, I think. So, it's this constant tension that's probably what life and living, both as ourselves and in different circles of relationships, like very intimate ones like children and spouse, to tight friends, to family, and then to organizations. It's that tension of this is me, this is you. And it's the negotiation sometimes of, I'm willing to lay some of this down for you, or actually I need this from you. It's the self-awareness to know I need a person who's very fastidious in details and is willing to execute. Whereas I love to have my eyes in the stars, and if we just had all of that, we'd all be gazing in the sky and nothing would get done. So.
What are we having for
Thank
lunch?
God for all those people. Lunch should be beautiful. Lunch should be amazing. Where's lunch? I don't know. So it is that.
And that's exactly at an organization level. That's a good part of what we work at is then, okay, so now that we've put some of these things in place, now that the members of your staff team, let's say, are starting to discover these things, what's the unique expression of how this particular team can best function? When these sorts of things need to be done, who should do them and who should be supporting them, and so on. And it takes it into a really interesting and it's almost like a puzzle-solving mode, where you really do get to look at, so what is being brought to the table here, and what's the best way to walk that out together as a group by intentionally honoring and calling out the best of what each person brings, and trusting everyone else to sort of cover for or fill in for or exceed in the areas where maybe we're weaker or we struggle or we wouldn't, instead of kind of having that mode of well, I'm the leader, so I have to kind of do everything or be good at everything, or I'm this person, so it's less of a role-based way of looking at it and more of a design-based way of looking at it, which takes some getting used to, but it can be really effective.
So let's talk a little bit about how, this could seem really selfish and navel-gazing, to be so concerned about like who am I and what am I doing and how do I be self-actualized, But in reality, there's probably some other dynamics. Tell us a little about how you've experienced it. Do you find that it actually becomes a more beautiful thing and the person is actually more able to give in this dynamic when they discover about the self?
Absolutely. That's always one of the interesting tensions. And I genuinely think that is a tactic that's specifically designed to keep us from discovering those things in the first place. That's its whole function, that thought process, because it's very understandable and it comes from a place of a really good motive. But ironically, I think one of the most selfless things that you can do is take the time to take inventory and get to know yourself for the purpose of coming to understand how you can live that out in a sacrificial way. Romans 12:1 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of Christ's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and spiritual act of worship." So the idea that actually it's calling us to live in a way that is somehow sacrificial, but you can't give something if you don't even know you have it in the first place.
Yeah, and Romans 12 even goes on to talk about like, hey, if you're this, live that. If you're this talented, if you're a giver, give. And do it all out of this essence of like humility, which is a real knowing of yourself, not a groveling. Love from trueness. Give from this trueness of who you are.
Exactly.
It's a very beautiful passage. Going from sacrifice to understanding self to humility.
Exactly. It gets exactly at this question. And what I have tended to observe at these DDQ events or whatever, when someone starts to see those things in themselves, it always leads to thoughts about how I can give out of this, what I can do out of this. I am a person who unleashes potential in others, who creates opportunities for. It's where it goes. It's easy to think, that's selfish. I need to be about going out and doing things. I can't spare an hour of reflective time to think about myself. I've got to spend that hour going and doing something that's been. But actually, an hour of reflective, engaging in prayer with God and with other people, especially if it's done in a context where there's some structure to it so that it's effective, can be the rocket launch pad that puts you on a really intentional trajectory towards purpose. An example that my dad uses a lot is if you have a fire hydrant and you just take the cap off, there's a lot of water pressure built up in there, and water just goes everywhere. Yeah. And it can be kind of fun, and you can have a block party on that, but you can't really put out a fire unless it happened to be right next to the fire hydrant. The only way that you're going to be able to use that to really accomplish the purpose of the thing is to hook a hose up to it. Okay. And what a hose does is it funnels all of that force down to one very specific, focused direction. And it's that focus and clarity of purpose that allows it to be used for something really good.
And I'm involved with a ministry that works with groups and helps people find some of these essential elements of who they are as well. And I find, and tell me if you find this to be true, that the group actually starts to affirm one another in their beauty. It's like, no, this is who you really are. No, don't be, and there's a lot of affirmation, don't be false to yourself, be true, be true. And then, the group is really, it's this accepting of oh, you're that kind of a person. Oh, what a blessing, and what a, and they start to affirm and actually drive that into the person, but also check that person so you're going to have these weaknesses too, and we're going to let you know.
Right, and here's how we're going to relate to
the flip side of creativity is controlling, and we're going to tell you when to stop that when you start doing that, and it becomes a more beautiful thing because you start living out of the trueness of who you are, and you have other people who can respond in honesty to you and affirm who you are, instead of this group constantly being at tension and sort of wondering in the backs of their minds and attributing all sorts of character flaws to people. Or even, there are true character flaws that come out of, unbalance, but never being able to address it or really name it accurately for the
Right.
other individual in a healthy way.
Right.
So all of
Having that foundation of intentionality and affirmation and support as part of your like communication is the thing that gives you the relational capacity and the relational equity to also then challenge each other, because then you know that it's not coming from a place of you really frustrate me, you need to fix yourself. It's coming from a place of I see you, I value you, and I deeply appreciate who you are, and I do that so much that I'm going to reflect back to you some ways where actually that's getting in your way, or it's coming at a cost to somebody else, and I want to walk with you in growing in that.
Yeah.
But it's a lot easier to receive that kind of perspective if you know it's coming from a person who really sees and values you and loves you and gets you, versus coming from someone who's actually just trying to like
Irritated with you.
fix you or put you in your place or something, because there's conflict there.
So really this self-awareness, particularly in the areas of traits and strengths and things like that we've discussed, it brings a vocabulary to relationships that, if it's shared,
Absolutely.
is so much more healthy. I mean, like when my wife is an introvert, she just says, "I need space,"
Right.
Or when I, suddenly violate her space and her time and her quiet, and she reacts, I, as an extrovert, going, "What are you doing?" And I could get really angry, and I have in the past, because it so jars me that someone would be irritated by someone coming into their space. But really, I should be affirming that, the beauty of that, and I have at times, I'm growing in that, and that dynamic is so much better than the dynamic where I'm seeing it as a character flaw, or I just not even dialoguing at all with this dynamic, of who she is and who I am, and the contrast of who we are, is so great. But now we can start saying, no, that's really who you are. You need to be that, and I can affirm her and say, go ahead, spend some alone time. I'll go off and be with my friends, or because I need this too. So I'm being true to myself, but I'm allowing her to be true to herself, and allowing ourselves to live out of that is a far greater, more life-giving place to be than to constantly be in conflict with one another and saying, because I'm sure if you put two of me together, we'd hate each other too, because we'd drive each other nuts over time.
Two human people, it's all it takes to have a little bit of a conflict going on. So yeah, absolutely. No, that's completely true. It's amazing to see how the lens of thinking in terms of design and communicating in terms of design opens up just a completely different way of communicating. It really does.
Yeah. So it doesn't just work on an individualistic level, like, gee, I know who I am. But obviously we need to live in a real world, and there's a dynamic of life that we interact all the time. And so this is really seeing who I am and seeing who others are. It's like like a hyper vision that we can realize and begin to see the true landscape of who people are and who everyone is in connection to one another.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely,
it's a great dynamic that we can really celebrate. So you've talked about some resources, and maybe you can't rattle them off on the top of your head. Maybe we can just put them, as they say, below in the comments of our video here. So any resources in particular that have like a singular book that has kind of pops into your mind as being something that really clues you into some of this?
It's a little difficult to name a single source because human nature is so complex.
Yeah, but maybe a few or one that just pops into your mind.
Fields, but yeah, it's a sort of an older book. It's a little hard to find, but it's called "Do What You Are." It's a book that was written kind of in the mid-90s, but it's taking the Myers-Briggs personality system and extrapolating from that to help you think about work and career. There's actually another one that gets at parenting. So there's a couple of different books that I think it's called Parent by Design or something like that. Anyway, there's several different books centered around the Myers-Briggs system, and for me personally, I have found the Myers-Briggs and the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, to be the most helpful single source of just, if you want to do one thing to start to understand who you are, and in the sense of how do you process your experiences, how do you make decisions, and how do you relate to other people, and how do other people do that as well, in a way where you can learn to quickly recognize those indicators and kind of adjust and adapt and not be thrown off so much. It's probably the single most useful of all of those, of all the systems that I've seen for working at personality distillation.
Okay.
There's a lot of really good ones. There's also a really good book called Positive Intelligence by an author named Shirzad Shamin. His website, Positive Intelligence, is also really good. But he kind of comes at this from a slightly different angle, he helps you look at what he calls a set of saboteurs, which are kind of thought processes that we all sort of carry with us that are kind of limiting perspectives.
Yeah.
So the assessment, you can take the test on his website, and it's a pretty good, simple way of, it explains the concept really well, and the results that you get back are really clearly laid out, so it's easy to understand. But the book does a pretty good job, especially like the preface in the first 2 chapters, do a really good job of kind of laying out a fairly well-described way of understanding kind of mental health and growing in and maturing in your own sense of self over time. So it's also kind of a good starting point to think about some of those things. All of that stuff has to do with more like the personality distillation side of things. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, that tends to be, for someone who hasn't really, maybe has not thought this way before, and this is sort of a new topic or a new way of thinking, I think that's a pretty good place to start, because it gives us some, it's a more tangible area of design and sort of traits, like you were talking about, to get started with working at and learning about yourself. Also, the Destiny Discovery Quest course, you can go to the website, destinydiscoveryquest.com, and find out if it's an event-based thing. But it's a pretty good, like, comprehensive thing that walks you through. We're going to look at dreams. We're going to look at core values. We're going to go look at, like, significant moments in your life and what can you extrapolate from that in terms of information about your design and purpose. So if this is something you'd really like to dig into, going to one of those events is a really great way to kind of get a large crash course in that mode of thinking and get a lot of information out of that all at once.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate your input and your insights, and thanks for sharing your time with us. Feel free to subscribe to our videos so we can get more great videos, and support our videos so we can do more videos like this. Thanks for Curation, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you some more. See you later, Justin. We want to delve more deeply into the matters of the heart. So if you want to grow and learn more about life, you've come to the right place.